There are several people yet to testify, so let's keep us time in mind.
Good morning. Thanks, Chairman Leahy. I hear you, and we'll slash a bunch of this script to try to keep it short. But thanks to you and Senator Leising and the committee for hearing me. I'm Jeff Dukes. I'm the director of the Purdue Climate Change Research Center. And I remove this mask for a minute, which is wonderful. I've led the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment for the past 4 years, and my disciplinary research examined carbon between plants and soils in the atmosphere. And to be clear, I'm speaking only for myself today, not on behalf of the university. And I do support the idea of a program like this for Indiana. Land management practices can degrade the carbon in soil or build it up. And we've heard one important example today in the testimony from Rick Clark and Ray McCormick. One of the many practices that they incorporate on their land, and one that's important, is implementing cover crops. Cover crops are effective at putting more carbon into the soil. And if you want to think about it in a, maybe an easier way to think about it is that on average, adding cover crops as a management practice to farmland, it might take about 35 acres of farmland to offset the annual emissions of a car on the road. So it's not a huge amount of sequestration, but it's not super fast, but it is sequestration. And the rate really is quite variable depending on the land and exactly the practices. So I'm giving you average, but better practices, probably the ones that are implemented by the farmers you heard from today, probably sequester carbon faster than that. And of course, cover crops have lots of other benefits that you get along with the carbon sequestration, minimizing erosion or retaining nutrients or improving water quality, and so on. And so cover crops and a variety of other agricultural practices that are referenced in can be effective at reducing emissions or increasing carbon sequestration on farms. And then forests store lots of carbon. You just heard about that from Professor Novick, so I'm not going to go into that in detail. I will say that they store carbon much faster when they're growing than the practice like cover crops will store carbon in soils. And so maybe that offsetting the emissions of that one car while the forest is actively growing might take something like 4 acres instead of 35. But again, there's a lot of variability from place to place and stage of growth that the forest is in. And you have to think when you're talking about programs like this as to what would be happening otherwise on that land. And are you actually incentivizing with this program more sequestration than would happen otherwise on a particular parcel of land, of course. And that makes it a little bit complicated. And so I do want to emphasize that that this concept is complex. Like for forests, you need to think about both short-term storage and average carbon storage over long periods of time. Dr. Novick mentioned that, you know, a forest fire can wipe out a whole bunch of the carbon that's being stored on the landscape. And so you need to be thinking about rotation periods and what are logging practices like? Is this something that's going to be logging practices in some way that's sequester more carbon than would be otherwise? So there's a level of unpredictability associated with the amounts of carbon that would actually be stored on a given parcel of land in a program like this. It's really hard to estimate up front how fast carbon is going to be stored because of a particular practice. But if you average across many projects, then your estimates of, say, soil carbon storage rates are likely to be much more reliable. They'll sort of average out that variation. So then there's also challenges with projects that reduce logging on specific parcels of land. So how do you make sure that these restrictions don't just push the logging somewhere else? It's not to say that programs like this are bad. It's just I'm making the point that they're more complicated than they might appear at first. And so it's really important, I think, that in a draft bill like this, you do have something like the advisory council that's there. So Purdue is named in the current draft as contributing at least one member of the Advisory Council on Climate-Friendly Farming and Forestry Practices. And I can confirm that our university has many researchers with deep expertise on carbon storage in forests and in agricultural soils. And so I think that we would be a good institution to provide some perspective on that program as it went along. Of course, there are other states and counties who are looking into or moving forward with programs like these that can provide some examples and some help in figuring out how this should work and be managed going forward. And some examples are Colorado and California, Oregon, New York, Hawaii, all have some sort of program in place or under examination. King County, Washington has its own program in place. I suspect you'll hear about others later today. But in summary, I think Indiana's farmers, agricultural landowners, and forest landowners can all benefit from a program like that in the draft bill. The additional income from participating in these programs could be used to help manage our forests and farmlands in a more sustainable manner. So thanks for your time, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Okay, thank you. Questions from committee, Representative Eberhardt.
Yes, sir, in your testimony you mentioned logging practices.
Yeah.
Is it your opinion that proper forest management, which would include logging, would that increase the carbon capture compared to non-management?
I mean, I'm a scientist, so I'm going to say it depends, right? It depends on what your idea of proper forest management is, what you're trying to achieve, but I think there are forest management practices that can include some level of logging that will, so I guess the question is, what's your baseline, right? What would happen in the forest otherwise? If you implement a management practice that takes out, that's not a clear cut, that is judiciously taking out some of the trees, leaving others to potentially grow faster, you may have much less of an impact on carbon storage. You would have much less of an impact on carbon storage than if you're clear cutting it. So it just depends on what the definition is and what you think the baseline is for that land. What would the practices be going forward otherwise? Well, I'm not wiggling out of that answer too much, but it's a complicated question to answer, I think.
Well, you're familiar with our DNR, who's an award-winning group of folks that I think do a great job on forest management. That's what I'm referring to, the technique and processes they use in our state forests. Would you agree that their type of management practices on forestry land would compare very favorable to carbon capture compared to non-management?
I think, they manage lands for a variety of different purposes, and I think that they generally do a great job. I can't tell you off the top of my head exactly what the implications of different management practices are going to be for carbon storage on each different parcel. I think they're managing for a variety of different reasons in different places. So I would trust them to give you a great answer on that, but I don't trust myself to give you a great answer on that.
Good answer.
Any other questions for committee? I don't see any more, Jeff. Thank you very much.